Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on cybersecurity, information security, GDPR, all things data protection. No, Ellie has not transformed. I'm Michael, and I'm delighted to be facilitating today. Cybersecurity and information security is an area that I'm very interested in, and myself and Ellie actually went to a seminar in February about it. Before all of this kicked off. So we're both very interested, and we're delighted today to welcome John Papalicio, the founder of Sovi.com, and his team, including Ellie, co-founder. Sovi is a new compliance technology company focusing on helping SMEs internationally with compliance obligations. They have a cloud and advisory service, and I'm sure that you'll have a very interesting webinar with them today. As always, we welcome your questions and input throughout. John will be leading the session, and I will be jumping in to ask questions from time to time, and some of the other team might join as well. So with that said, I'd like to hand over to John Papalicio for today's webinar.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ellie. And thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to share my screen. So thank you all for joining this morning. This workshop is entitled Privacy and Data Protection in the Remote Working World. We're going to be covering a number of topics today in the whole concept of privacy, data protection, and focusing in on the remote working right now during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as then getting ready to go back to both on-prem and remote working. So this is the front slide that we had for privacy and data protection in the remote working world. What we're going to cover are a number of topics, and we're going to do a walkthrough. And specifically, what I want to do is share our views and some guidance and some tips in the areas of privacy, conduct, and data protection. But specifically, when we're combining the concept of remote working, of which we all are now, and then preparing to return to the on-site operations, of which then I would imagine many of us are going to be continuing to do remote working. There's going to be rolling shifts and things like that. So I think that the combination really poses an interesting lens to take a look at privacy, conduct, and data protection. We'll focus in and use the general data protection regulation as a base. There's many other regulations and privacy rules that are coming into play, especially for businesses that are cross-border and trade and have partners around the world. But we'll focus in on GDPR today, as that is the main base. We'll look at some of the challenges that stem when you can look at privacy, employee conduct, and data protection together. We'll explore the changes, and Michael will jump in, and we'll take questions from the group, as well as have some back and forth regarding potentially some questions that will turn into maybe a mini case study or two. We'll see what the questions come up with. And lastly, there's a couple of regulator guidance and court decisions that we weave in and out of here. It's very interesting because I think in the past year, there's been some updated guidance, as well as some court cases that are changing the way that we look at privacy and data protection. So a little bit about me, that we want to keep this the webinar educational, and so this way your questions and our back and forth will help that. You'll get the slides afterward, and this is being recorded, so you'll have a chance to go back, stop, take some notes, and we're always available afterward. So my background, I have a long history in tech, risk, compliance, and security. I've done some really fun stuff in my career. Early days enabling city banking with a large team for Citibank, involved in e-payments, early cyber, did some crisis management. very passionate, and our team here at Sovi is very, very passionate about helping SMEs. We saw over the years when we were working with large clients that SMEs, especially involved in supply chain, we're getting hammered by regulations and getting hammered by supplier risk reviews and all the things that that we're getting asked of them. And as you said, well, there's got to be a better way. So we founded Sovi in order to simplify business compliance, and we built an online compliance as a service. We've started off with privacy, we've added conduct, and we're going to be adding anti-fraud there. A couple of housekeeping items. Um, I can offer insight, but I'm not an attorney. And so what we're going to talk about is not legal advice. And I certainly can't speak for the regulators. And although I do agree with many of the things they say, they may not agree with some of my interpretations because some of their interpretations go very deep. And then we have lots of discussions over years, as we've seen in other regulations, and then they normalize out. We're going to be using publicly available information for this webinar. We note our sources, we note the copyrights, and we refer to companies, but that doesn't mean that we endorse them. So if we get started, so the backdrop really is three things coming together, and I'd like to come back to these three topics during the course of the webinar. One of the things is increasingly complex rules of trade. So what I mean by that is that as we start doing more business digitally, as well as on-premise, and with supply chain partners, and with distribution partners, and using different types of marketing, sales, and service, we meet more complex rules. As each country and each region starts looking at their rules of privacy, their rules of conduct, their rules for employment rights, it basically places a pressure on especially SMEs and large companies as well, but we'll be focusing on more of the SME view. We are now thrust into global remote working conditions that poses a whole set of challenges because of the fast ramp up, as well as then the sustained nature of this. What it does is it draws attention to there's so many cloud services that we pull together and that we've spun up in order to handle the global remote working conditions. So when you look at the different types of businesses that I put in the lens and we put in the lens of SMEs, it really runs the whole spectrum. We have family-run businesses. We have businesses that are part of digital and physical supply chains and that serve those supply chains, some of which are deemed essential and have to find a way in order to operate with the social distancing guidelines, with the staggered work guidelines, as well as just meeting the demands of caring for employees and their families and looking out for them. We have a focus on subsidiaries and franchises because when in these times when those subsidiaries and franchises may have relied on central services from the franchisee, I mean the franchise. The franchisees may not have the ability in order to do the same things to serve their customers. We have also a focus on high turnover workforce and what that does with shuttering businesses that are largely on-prem and now forced to wait it out in order to get back to work, as well as then looking at sole traders and work at home who may feel more comfortable in this situation because they have already been there. But the issue that we're facing when you look at this in totality, when you look at privacy, conduct, anti-fraud, and employment, those areas are blending and are getting a high lens on them because of the global working environment. So let's step back here and take a look at GDPR. This is a very busy ecosystem chart, and we could stay on this chart for quite a long time. What we'll end up doing most likely is when we get questions, we'll come back in and out of this. But let's just take a level set so we get some of the basic terminology and the things that we'll be discussing. So when we look at GDPR, if you look at the top, it's a global scope. It applies to any EU business, and it applies to businesses that offer goods and services within the EU. And who are we talking about? We're talking about people. And they call them data subjects. I really don't like the term. Many people don't like the term, but it is really about people and their data. And it's a focus on the person. There's two main other terms that you'll hear: a data controller, who is responsible and who makes the decision about how to handle the personal data of a person, as well as then a data processor, such as HubSpot, who then takes instructions from the controller and does that processing. We have the supervisory authorities. Two examples are very prominent: our own Data Protection Commission and the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. When you take a look at then the next row on the top, on the left side, we've got the myriad personal data, and the chart there shows how the individual pieces that can make up and basically get attributed as personal data get interconnected. And then underneath that, you see that there's the concept of identity. So there is an identified concept, and then there's an identifiable concept. This is quite important because depending on how you then take a look at privacy and what you're doing as a controller, taking in personal information and processing it, you're either processing it yourself or handing it off to a processor, then you're taking a look at the concept of, have you identified and can you identify a person? And therefore, you have very clear view into protecting their rights. Are you handling information that in one piece or many pieces can then identify a person? Well, you then have additional obligations in order to then pull that information together, protect it, handle it properly. We'll get into that in a little bit. You have there's a whole host of rights that the GDPR offers to individuals. So the main piece is that you have to have the right, and you have the right to be informed, and it needs to be transparent from the controller and the data processor, what they're doing with your personal data. You need to have access to that data. You need to be able to request access to the data. You need to be able to correct things when they're wrong, to request to have it erased, and sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. We'll get into that. You can restrict or object to certain types of processing, such as the automated decision making and profiling. And the concept of automated decision making and profiling it can get quite deep. There are some specific rules and specific things in the regulation regarding that. We won't get into depth today. That could be an interesting follow-up webinar in the future. There you have data portability. You can request your information to be sent to you in a machine readable format, an easily transportable one. You could also lodge a complaint with a supervisory authority if you don't think that your personal data has been handled properly, if you've raised an issue with the data controller or processor, and you think that that needs to get the attention of the supervisory authorities. So when you look then at a person, the data subject, and you look at the concept of consent, you see this over and over again in privacy regulations, that you should be able to consent, grant it, or withdraw it, and from using and having someone handle your personal information, your personal data. And the concept of consent is generally freely given, informed, and unambiguous, meaning that you have to know the conditions that you're giving the consent to use your personal data, as well as then it needs to be clear what that data controller is doing. Now, sometimes there is a concept of explicit consent, and that is more detailed and usually comes with additional steps, whether they're electronic steps or they're physical steps, reading a form, signing something, ticking a box, making sure do something active. And that's also very important because some of the recent court decisions, some of the recent regulator guidance really goes into detail where they're starting to specify the conditions of consent. When you look at on the right side, there's what we call the lawful six. So if you're taking in and handling personal data, so you're a small business and you have employees, you have contractors, the lens, we say the internally facing lens, you're looking into your company and you're accountable for handling their personal data properly. If you're a small business and you have your clients or your guests, you are accountable for handling their personal data properly. And some difficult decisions have to be made when you look at how you're handling data. You have to describe why you're legally why you're legally allowed in order to handle that data as you are. And so, as we talked about, consent is the first. Other than that, it could be a contract. So you've contracted with your client provides you with personal data, you are handling that personal data, you have a care of that data. You could be complying with a legal obligation to an authority in order to provide information into revenue, for instance. Legitimate interest is a very interesting one because it is broad. You'll generally see people when they're analyzing the data that they're handling, they'll say, well, do I need to get consent? Or is it in the business interest in order to serve that client or serve that guest and do what they would think is reasonable with their personal data in order to handle that request? So there's a balancing test. Well, there's actually three tests that that you focus on in terms of their purpose test. They call it the necessity test, and they call it a balance test. We won't get into all these types of things, but understand that if you say, well, I'm going to handle this personal data, and I don't need to get consent, and I'm going to rely on legitimate interest, there's some additional steps that we have to take. The last two we won't get into, that gets a little bit deeper into topics that we won't cover today. So then, now stepping back and taking a look at the next row, we've discussed identity. The important aspect for a small business or a business that's in a supply chain or a larger business is that you need to have a compliance program that is fit for purpose. There's a lot of things here. In many cases, it is a thin line and not a difficult set of tasks to do, even for a small business, in order to do the basic things that are needed in order to have a proper compliance program. So we won't go through all these pieces now because we'll discuss them in more example based during the webinar. The concept of processing is doing anything with that personal data. Third parties come in into play a lot, especially with cloud services, and especially when we have digitally interconnected as well as physically interconnected companies working together and handling and moving personal data amongst those parties. There's a concept of a data processing agreement. We'll discuss that. And when you look at the movement of information amongst a controller to a processor, to a small business, to a cloud service, or to their partners that might handle. So a business might be using HubSpot for marketing, and then that information is going to a service that will handle email outbound mail for that small business. Those three are working in concert, and they have obligations to each other, and they have obligations to people and that they're handling the personal data. On the lower left corner, takes up a lot of space because it is very important. There are specific categories of sensitive data that the regulations call out to protect people and their rights for this particular information. Some of it's actually very important in our discussions because you're going to be getting in as a business owner access to health information, and you may have questions about, well, because we're in this remote working environment, because we are looking at tight shifts for essential businesses that don't have enough personnel in order to operate that business, I have to make decisions as a business owner, and I'm going to be getting information that I may not be, have been privy to before regarding health information. How do I handle it? You may be getting in CVs and professional details, and you may not be asking for trade union membership, but it might be on someone's professional details, and so you are then in receipt, and you should handle it properly. And then there's other types of data like biometrics where you say, well, I'm not really going to be processing and handling biometrics. Well, if you start enabling multi-factor authentication, so two-step authentication, which may include a thumbprint to get access to a device, well, depending on how you've set up your access into those services, you might be in receipt and you may be handling that biometric information. And so what ends up happening is that you may be handling information that you didn't realize that you're handling, and you may not be handling it in the way that the regulation wants you to handle it. So I think it's very important as we get into the discussions that we start looking at how do you then get your arms around the data that you're handling, and then navigate in a fit for purpose way, in a step-by-step way, through the privacy rights, through that lawful six, in order to run your compliance program. Now, lastly, and down in the bottom center is the dreaded cookies and the dreaded cookie banner. And I don't know about you, and we're in the business, we don't like cookie banners. We think that they're very clumsy, and I would say probably, if I put my predictive hat on, 24 months, 36 months, we might be seeing some different interaction models in order to handle consent management, and digital marketing tracking. I think there's some very interesting things that are coming on the horizon. But for now, we have a lot of these pop-ups. Some are very informative, some are not. With some of the new regulations and some of the new guidance and some of the court decisions, these banners are going to be changing, and they're probably going to be changing quick. So we'll go over that as well. I'll stop here for a moment. And Michael, if there's questions that are coming in where we could, that would level set, that I'm happy to take those now.
Yeah, John, I think that that was really comprehensive and very interesting. I suppose on the biometric data, I mean, there are a lot of different apps now that you might see on social media that people are exposed to on a daily basis that would read their face or turn them into a different celebrity. So there's everything from that to the business side. But I suppose what would be some of the key things that people need to look out for when they're being asked for biometric information?
Well, I think that's also important because when we're at home, we're at home working, we're on our own devices unless the companies provide us with a device. So we have so many things going on that device. So we could have enabled it, right? So we could be enabling those features because we're using them, or the company could have enabled that feature and asked and said, this is an alternate way in order to identify yourself, authenticate yourself to the applications that we're using. Some of the things that when someone is presented with the choice to download the app, accept the permissions, and use it, one of the things that we say is necessary, it's not very fun, but it's necessary, is to look at the terms of service and to then take a look at the privacy policy and to take a look at if there is a data processing um, policy specific to the biometric data or the authentication data.
Sure.
If you could basically be surprised the things that you'll see in these terms of service in terms of that they'll claim ownership of information. They'll claim that they'll be able to do whatever they want with it. And
Royalty-free use and all
oh,
this kind of thing.
it's
Yeah.
absolutely
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, you do, yeah. So you do, it is very important. It's important to tell the kids and to emphasize it over and over again. Read the terms of service. Read the end user license agreements. They're boring, but they're really telling.
And would there be sort of maybe 3 key things that people should look out for in the text that would be helpful in terms of understanding what's being done with their data and for how long and by whom?
Well, definitely. I think that the top one is I look for ownership rights. Um, if there's dodgy language in there that it just doesn't feel right, then don't use the app. I think the second piece is what are they really doing with it? Many of the companies are becoming um, more aware and then getting better at describing how they're processing that information and how they're storing it, where they're sending it. So are they sending it to areas of the world that aren't recognized that having good privacy? So that's a second piece that we look at. And then the third really is about retention. And then from retention is really also more broad use rights because usually rides hand in hand. They'll tell you how long they're going to retain it, but then there's usually some caveats for the ones that you go, I'm really not sure if I want to do this in terms of what else they're going to do.
Absolutely. And 2 things as well that you mentioned. You mentioned the 2-factor authentication. And I have a keen interest in this, but I was looking at the RSA conference, which you might be familiar with, and that's available on YouTube. It's a really in-depth conference from other security experts. And they discussed that as one of the top 5 key risks to people at the moment, and something that people really need to be aware of. And it sounds so simple, but it's very effective.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll get into into passwords and good password management later on. But the importance of having an ability so that there is another way to prove that you're you, and in order to protect your access into these applications is so important. So you'll hear multi-factor authentication. You'll hear two-step sign in. You'll hear SMS or text or authenticator apps. There's many different ways in order to have that second step, and even the third step in terms of the secret questions that could get popped up.
A third
And
step. Wow.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
as well as
Yeah.
then even sensitive, even when you do that, and let's say in banking applications, in some banking applications, in order to send out a wire,
Yeah.
then there is an at that time set of steps, of which then is a focused multi-factor authentication for highly sensitive transactions. So why is it so important? Because passwords are generally very easy to crack if somebody wants to get at them, mostly because humans just don't know how to make a strong password. We have a great slide from just a wonderful service out there that's been around for a while, and there's just a classic cartoon in terms of that. People have been for so long making passwords that they can't remember, but are very easy for computers to crack. We got to
Yes.
flip that around. So if you have light passwords and you have determined people to get them, having multiple ways of getting in is extremely important.
Okay. I'll leave you to it there, and I'll come
Great.
back on later on. Thanks, John.
Right. Very good. And then we'll leave this and we'll come back to it with questions after. So when we're talking about personal data, what we like to do is start with the concept of handling. And this is a great slide that's been making its way all around the web for quite some time, and just because it is just so clear. And it's so if you go from 1 to 6, you're thinking what type of personal data do you gather? So that's understanding the different personal data types: the name, the address, the email. When you've got a website, are you picking up IP address? Are you using different types of analytics to understand how your visitors are navigating your site and what journeys they're taking on your site? Why are you gathering it? Are you using that information for taking in and looking at candidates for a job? Are you looking at that information, processing that information for marketing purposes? Do you have a contract and you have information to take the information personally from clients in order to move goods and services and to allow them into a portal to track? Do you regularly review the data for accuracy? This is really important because part of where companies get into trouble is because they're really good in the front part of the process, and they say, yep, I know the data I'm taking in, I know why I'm gathering it, I can analyze that quite well, and then over time the data gets moved from one system to another, or that you have lists that that information ages off and they don't keep it up to date. And so procedures for making sure that that especially personal data, and even more especially the special category sensitive personal data, are accurate and kept up to date. How do you store it? Where is it stored? So this is where we can get into a whole host of discussions about cloud service providers, the information that gets stored and the information get passed. As an example, so a small business, and I forget where the stats were coming in from, but there's the stats were saying that a small business could spin up 10, 20, or 30 cloud services just to run their business these days. And you might not think about it, but you think, okay, I'm using the Google Suite, or I'm using Microsoft's Office 365, and then you take a look at communications. We're on Zoom right now, and then you've got uh, Skype communications, you've got WhatsApp communications, you've got then all of the marketing and sales cloud services. You have the really cool stuff that's out there in terms of making it easier to make graphical presentations. And they're all cloud-based. You have easier ways to make explainer videos. All of these services, whether they're interconnected or not, pose a obligation for you as a business to understand what information is flowing, where is it being stored, how is that cloud service provider handling it. So it could seem overwhelming, but taking it step by step and understanding how that cloud service works, how you get access into it, what connections does that cloud service require of you. For instance, when you go into Microsoft Office 365 and you're using the communication and the instant messaging Teams, of which it also does much more, there are abilities in order to connect to the other cloud services. So the whole concept of sharing in Office 365 and the permissions or the restrictions that you place on it are extremely important. So I think when we get into cloud service discussions, understanding not only the list of those cloud services, how they're handling your data, where you're moving that data, but then having a good look at the permissions and where that data moves is extremely important. Retention is another topic. In early on, prior to GDPR coming into play, retention was very important when you're looking at employment rights, employment law, as well as some of the precursors to GDPR for privacy. When GDPR came on, and then some of the other regulations that are around the world, retention is an extremely important concept, and it is also a very good way for you to do number 3 and number 4 properly, because by understanding how long you need to keep the data, well, basically helps you then say, well, I don't need to keep this data now. So for instance, there's guidance that say if you've got a job opening and you're taking in a CV and you're reviewing candidates, 6 months is roughly a rule after the job closes in order to hold on to that CV for a number of purposes. There could be candidates who might want explanation, and you need to have that information at the ready so that you can provide them good explanations to the extent that you can and should. There's also then if you need to reopen it. So, and then there's rules and guidance that say, well, if you need to keep that information or you want to keep that information longer, well, you need to then gather consent. So the concept of retention, not only is it really in terms of knowing how long you're going to keep that information, as well as telling someone so that they're clear, but there's a whole host of we call privacy operations or compliance operations tasks and procedures that are affected by knowing retention or not knowing retention. And then lastly, can you readily comply with individuals' rights to access, erasure, and portability? Very important. So all 1 through 5 really give a focus on and your ability to comply with rights requests. So if someone is asking you as a processor of their information or as a controller of their information, what personal data do you have on me? Can you go and find that information? Do you even know where it is? And do you know what information that you need to provide them by regulation, or information that is optional? Very important in order to handle those rights requests properly. So, stepping back, a couple of quick checklist tasks, and then we'll take some questions on the data handling. So, and then there's a number of steps that you can insert in these major bullets. But I think at a top level, when you're looking at it, finding and recording and then analyzing the personal data that handled is very important. There's a concept backed on the ecosystem chart called records of processing. And so there is a technique in order to gather and describe that personal data, the business reasons why you're handling it. You then assign that one of the 6 lawful bases, basically the legal reasons why you handle it. And that record starts to build, and it gives you that data map. And some businesses like to look at it from activity. So is it an HR activity? Is it a marketing activity? And looking at it from an internal view versus an external view. And in some of the automation that we provide, that's how we separate it out so that a business can take it chunk by chunk. And there's other tools and other techniques that are out on the market that will focus the journey in similar ways, where they're trying to simplify for a business how to take these first steps into finding and recording and analyze the information. So the concept of reducing the information or removing it, do you really need it? So there's a concept of data minimization. Do you really need to process this information? So if you ask yourself at every step of an activity, or at least have a check and balance, so that periodically you're looking at your procedures and say, am I taking in too much information? Do I really need this? Can we remove it? That helps to reduce the obligations and then actually reduce cost in your compliance program. Understanding when you need to notify people, and that could be on the front end in a privacy notice of what information you're handling, what are your privacy practices, do you have a contact person or a contact address for someone to ask questions. Did you need a data protection officer, um, a knowledgeable, trained privacy professional? And there's a number of rules that and tests that they can either show that you do need one by regulation, or if you feel more comfortable in having one, then it's optional. So it's that the personal notifications about right up front, or when something happens, if you have an adverse data event, a breach, then there's certain rules about notifying people. When you take a look at the suppliers and your supply chain and those cloud service providers, you need to be comfortable that they're doing the things that you want them to do, and they must do by obligation to handle data properly. I think this is going to be an area that small to mid-sized businesses, because of the remote data, the remote working conditions, are going to have their eyes opened, as well as then it's going to be a positive experience because they're going to understand and they're going to be able to take control of understanding, documenting, and guiding how they use those cloud service providers. They're going to have to, and I think that they're going to embrace it, because we see it just from some of our clients and our partners, that they're becoming more aware of what those parties are doing with the data that you're entrusted to handle. And I think that's an extremely important point that we can get into, is that you have the obligation and you can't pass that obligation off, but you can pass off the activities under your supervision. So responding and reporting, we do touch on just a bit in terms of, in order to notify, you have to be able to understand and determine, has there been an adverse data event? Has data gone missing? Has it been compromised? Has someone accessed system in an unauthorized way? And then when you do see that, then there's a decision to make and an analysis to say, well, how bad was it? Is it deep enough? Is it bad enough? Is there that much data that has gone out that I need to notify the regulator? Because there is a 72-hour rule for breach notifications. Then there are rules for notifying the people that are affected. And then lastly, when you take a look at the design of privacy at the start of systems or processes or new things that you're doing for your business, when you're looking at rolling out a new product or a service, there's a concept of privacy by design, meaning that you're going to take into consideration the personal data that you're handling, as well as the uh, the obligations and the activities you need to do in order to build privacy right from the start. And there's a number of tools that the regulators have specified, and that the industry has started to provide more guidance on is really how are you doing a data privacy impact assessment? How are you analyzing? What are the steps you can take? So it's not a mystery, and it's actually easy to do, especially for a small business that is rolling out a new service. There are just key steps, as well as then the one that people don't do what they should do is what's called a legitimate interest analysis test. That's very important to have in the compliance program. And we can get into that later on, I think, after some of the checklist discussions and the things to do, because I think that's an important concept to understand. I'll stop here, Michael, and see if we have questions.
That's brilliant, John. Some really key points there. I have a couple of questions myself, but we do have a question in from Kevin. And Kevin's query is referring to special categories section. Are you allowed to ask for such specific details such as political views, sexual orientation, religious beliefs, if putting people into a position? So we've looked into this, and this is more of a HR question. And we are looking to provide a HR and insurance webinar because we've had a number of queries coming through. But at the moment, this does fall under the Equality Act. So there are 9 grounds for discrimination, and these would be some of the grounds. So it's illegal to discriminate on any of those terms in this case. So no, that wouldn't be something that you're allowed to do. So I just thought we
Right.
would come in on that in terms of an Irish perspective. But in relation to some of the other questions that we have, it would be if someone is running a small business, say less than 10 people, how much compliance would they really need to do? And is there sort of like top 3 in terms of prioritizing?
Sure. I think what I'll do is I'll go back to the chart here because we can pick out certain
Yeah, this
pieces.
is excellent, this chart. It's really, really intuitive.
So when you take a look at a small business, from sole traders to 5, 10 people, and you're worried about serving your customers, you're worried about making payroll, and you say, oh my goodness, I've got to now deal with compliance obligations. So I think the top pieces that are very, very important for a small business is, as we were just discussing, think about the personal data elements that you handle and why you're doing it. And it could be as simple as taking out a pad of paper and jotting down and saying, well, in my marketing, I have a website, I have a form, and I'm taking in this information, and it gets to me by email. And I don't buy into in any customer relationship management systems. I'm old school, or I'm using the Microsoft Office suite, and I use Excel. It's not that difficult. It does take a little time at first, but then it gets quicker as you go, in order to say, oh, yep, I take this information. Then you see that you're taking in the same information over and over again, but you're doing it for different purposes. That's the second thing that is very important, is to understand. So you've got the data that you've got coming in, then you've got the purpose. So if you understand the data and you understand the purposes, now you're differentiating how you're using that data. You've now
Yeah.
taken 2 big steps in documenting. And I guess then the third piece really is to say, how much? What are you taking in a lot of information, or are you taking in a little bit of information? If you're taking a lot of information, many of these things do apply. So you could be, half a dozen people, but you're doing a lot of processing of personal data. And if you're doing some really cool stuff with it and different analytics and all, yeah, you're triggering
Yeah.
a lot of things here. So I think those are the top 3 to get started. And I would say the fourth is just to make sure that everyone's trained, because
Oh yes, definitely.
um, there is a comfort knowing that everyone that you're working with has the same basic understanding of the GDPR and the obligations, as well as I think it's a comfort for customers to know that you respect their privacy.
Absolutely, you have a duty of care to your customers. And it goes back to what you were saying there, John, about the legitimate interest analysis to have that discussion in your team and to bring minds around the table.
I think so, because one of the hard bits to get over is really thinking about when you need to ask for and then record and then manage consent, because consent is a cycle. So someone can grant you consent to use their information for a particular purpose, and then you'll say, okay, great. So you've opted in to an email that I sent out, and I've asked, would you like to receive more information from us? Yes, you would. Great. Okay, so that is an event. But that event has a life cycle. You have to determine what's a reasonable amount of time then in order to keep that information and to keep that interaction with that person going. And if that person then just never contacts you, and you sent out one mail, two mails, three mails, so that you have to determine what's a reasonable period for your business and a reasonable number of times in order to continue to reach out with getting no response. So there's in that is really more art than science. But I think that as we see more and more businesses, unfortunately, get put under a spotlight from regulators and their practices, we'll start getting more of an industry and business norms through those
Yeah.
actions.
I've noticed that the Google algorithm is showing, basically, Google's technology is showing me in emails when I haven't read, say, if I'm subscribed to Wired magazine or something like that, that I haven't looked at that email maybe in the last month, and it's asking me if I want to unsubscribe. That seems to be a new feature that they've brought in.
So the techniques, the analytics techniques are both positive because they will raise your awareness and become a knowledgeable consumer and a knowledgeable recipient of particular requests.
Yes.
Some of the things that we'll maybe touch on later if we have time. I know that while working remote, um, there seems to be more and more emails for lead generation services and list broker services, and saying, well, since you can't market and your sales are now down because of COVID, think about using our lead gen services. Think about using our list broker services. Well, there's so many red flags from a privacy perspective that come in when I see those, and especially you read through some of them and they're going, yeah, well, we've got all these data points and we've got all this information and you can use it, and they're going, wow, right?
Yes.
Where did you get it? Is it, did you get it lawfully? Do you even have the right to use it? Can you even have the right to pass it to me to use it? So there's just, are things that are extremely important. We've got some items later on that
Okay.
focus on that.
Okay. Thanks very much, John.
Sure, let's go on. So I wanted to use a hospitality and small, let's say, family-run accommodation as an example, because there's a couple pieces that tie into what that we've started and where we want to go. So when you look at a small business, especially one that is quite uh, affected by COVID and remote working, because that's not their business. Their business is a people business. Their business is about people being together in their place. Now, so when we look at the fast forward in terms of returning back to the combination of on-premise and remote working, we can use this time right now in order to look at the operations of a small let's say, family-run accommodation business, and they could say, all right, how are we looking at our guests' privacy? What do they expect? What are our obligations? How do we make a trusted workplace from the eyes of our guests as well as our employees, especially with ongoing health concerns, and saying, well, are we ready to go back? When we do go back, what are new procedures that have to get put into place? And then when we look at the combination of some of the things that we've been talking about in the lens of this small business, we want to make sure that there's a comfort at the end of the day that privacy is respected there. So let's go right into an example. So this is an example from a blog and a travel log by Ben Lucky, and he posted this back in July of 2019. So if you read through it, it basically focuses on a hotel that got a 15,000 euro fine because of a breach. Well, what was the breach? Well, there were guest names on a list for breakfast, and it was photographed by an authorized party. How many small places, or even large hotel chains, where you'll go in and you'll see guest lists at breakfast? You'll see the lists that are tacked off to the side of housekeeping's cart, and you don't think too much of it because it's just something that it's just always been there. But with a lens of privacy and privacy compliance, there's it's first of all, I guess, stepping back, you say, wow, 15,000 euros for that. But part of it really was about that, as you mentioned before, Michael, that duty of care. And there's some very low-tech things that this business could have done, which is one, placing the guest list just in a folder, keeping the folder closed. So it just keeps honest people honest, and it keeps that information. There could be little slips for breakfast. So basically, if you have the slip, you present it, and you get breakfast. Yes, there may be some people that might use the slips that aren't technically entitled to it, but you also have to weigh the privacy regulations now and the privacy operations that you have to enable with doing business in a different way. So like I said, it doesn't have to be expensive. It could be just creative and similar to that list that might be on the housekeeping card. So then you also touched on, and then you said that you're going to have another webinar regarding HR and insurance and all. So these topics that are on the screen here, we could go into a lot of detail. I think that if we pick out, for the example of that small business, looking at training personnel so that they understand the importance of being vigilant about protecting people's data and privacy, would then start arming everyone in that hotel's operation in order to take a look at into situations where personal data might be compromised. And they would say, oh, well, you know what, I need to keep this covered, or I need to do things in a different way, or suggest doing things in a different way. So then when you take a look at from the training to the reporting, and keeping a clear view so that you have evidence, so that if there is an issue, you can show that, well, I do have a compliance program. I have trained people. We do discuss the data privacy. I've got a report that shows here's what we do on a month-to-month basis. And those statistics will show that, well, you're not negligent. You may have been unfortunate in order to have a breach. Maybe you had a bad actor. Maybe there was a break in operational protocol, but you weren't doing things in a willfully negligent way. And then lastly, I think that it was important because it'll touch into the other discussions we have coming up is security. And looking at your security procedures, both physical security and digital security. So I'll go through some points here, and then we'll take additional questions. So what we're talking about for this small business is, again, a fit for purpose, continual compliance commitment, where they're going to say, let's do a simple set of assessments so that we understand the personal data we handle. Let's understand what our policies are. Are they clear? Do our personnel, do they know what is expected of them? Is it in plain language? Are they trained in what's my periodic training? Because part of the regulation is periodic reviews, whether it's annual training, annual policy reviews, um, data handling assessments when business operations change, and that could be once a quarter, it could be once a year, but those reviews do need to have a set period or triggers based on business events. And then when you look at operational practice, this is where wading through that large visual chart to say, what do I really need to do? What do I need to do first? And as compliance is a journey. So it's not a once and done, and it doesn't need to be expensive. And so picking out the pieces through that journey is actually very important. And then showing that evidence of compliance, as we discussed, in order to say, we have a compliance program, we have data handling under control, that we understand that data, we understand how long we're retaining it, we're trying to minimize that data and say, well, if we don't need it, we're not going to use it, and then making sure that the operations can evidence that we're doing things in a proper way. So what I'll do is I'll stop here for a moment to see if we have additional questions, Michael.
Thanks, John. That's brilliant. We do have some questions. We have a question from Alice. Alice, thank you very much for your question. How long do we keep clients' data? Is there a deadline to destroy the data?
That's a very good question. So let me adjust here. So retention of clients' data. So I think it starts off with the type of business you're in, the type of activity that you're engaged with for the client, the purpose of that data, and then any agreements that you have. So if you have a service business, you're not going to be entering into contracts. So it's really about the norm of that business and how long you're going to be keeping that information and destroying it. So if you're in a food service business and you're keeping information about people that are calling up, ordering through the apps, then there is a period of time where you should say, well, what is reasonable? And we're seeing guidance starting to come out, and in fact, it's starting to look a lot more like prescription than guidance. And I got a bit of a problem with that, but that's a whole other, kind of getting on my soapbox and discussing regulatory overreach and privacy advocacy. But there's some guidance that seems to be focusing on this 6-month and 1-year test rule. And so if you don't have a contractual commitment that says, okay, we're going to be managing your data and handling your data for the period of the contract plus a period afterward. So let's say financially, if you have to keep the financial records 5 years, 7 years, whatever the term is, well, that's the period you need to keep it. If you don't have those contracts, then it starts to become a reasonableness test, and that's where it gets gray. So I think so contractual, it is through the contract plus a period that is either that are clearly stated in your contract, or again, norms because of the jurisdiction you're in, and for financial reporting reasons or regulatory reasons, you do need to keep that. If you don't have a contract, it becomes that reasonableness test, and putting a lens on it, saying, do I need to keep it more than 6 months? Why? Do I need to keep it more than a year? Why? If I want to, or if the person wants to grant me the permission, because maybe we want to keep that connection between the person and the company, then getting consent.
Okay, brilliant. So thanks very much, Alice, and great to have you back. And we have a question from Bassi as well, who's a
Okay.
regular visitor. So thank you very much, Bassi, for your question. What steps can you take proactively to keep your digital security up to date? And does it make sense to take out a GDPR insurance policy separate to your normal company insurance?
Great set of questions. So I think that from keeping your digital security and your digital protection up to date. So let's step back and think about what are the pieces of that, the practical pieces. So the practical piece, basically, if you're looking at it with the theme of the cloud services that we're talking about. So you're using a number of services, no doubt, and then understanding how you're gaining access to that. So administrator accounts, they generally what we call have higher privileges. They can do more. They can set security features. They can set data handling features. And so understanding and doing a periodic review of how many administrators, who those administrators are, have they been in the system? Are there any audit trails that have been enabled? Um, that's extremely important. The second piece then is, as we discussed before, looking at the interconnection and the data movement amongst systems. We were working with a client last week, and it was time to do a review because of the remote working. They had enabled a whole set of features in Office 365. And Office 365 can be a bit of a rabbit warren, when you're going in into understanding um, the permissions that are granted and then the sharing that happens because of Teams and some of the facilities are built on SharePoint, which is also then connected to OneDrive. And so understanding the permissions that the system has been enabled in order for then the system to start sharing. So we ended up seeing in one case on a mobile device, on a calendar, there was something that popped up that said insights. And that was basically, we traced it back to the My Analytics feature in Microsoft. Nobody had turned it on. It was a quote unquote feature from Microsoft that it was turned on for us and the client, and basically said, oh, wow, that's interesting, go turn it off. When you went to go turn it off in a global setting, and all of a sudden it wasn't getting turned off by the users. These are very important examples because if we didn't go and look at that depth, we would not know that there were certain sharing capabilities and certain analytic capabilities that Microsoft was doing with our data, our clients' data, and the data that was moving in. And it was something that was unknown to the client. So just one example. I guess then the third piece that I would suggest is then taking a look at the ability to turn on the two-step or the multi-factor authentication so that um, the passwords that are created by the people that are using those services are then uh, doubly protected in order to have something that they have and hold and that they have access to. So it's not just something that they know, but something that they have and hold. Very important.
Yes, and in terms of the policies, I'm seeing a lot of cyber policies coming up on different insurers. I know that my own insurer is offering that as well. So it seems to be something that's growing in significance and importance.
Right. I think being involved in some of the early days of cyber insurance and seemed to be more of, again, an art than a science. And I think that it still really is, can truly be considered more than art than a science because the underwriting is difficult on a small business perspective. The underwriting is getting better for very large businesses. We understand the extent of the issues that come up. We can see big corporate practices and um, large compliance programs, and we can see where potentially the maturity of them, if and we can compare that. when you look at the practical side of a cyber insurance policy, so a business owner's policy might have some provisions in order to have continuity of operations, some records restoration, maybe some investigation for some breach. But generally, that's where it will stop. And I think, Michael, if you've seen this as well, then when you start taking a look at the add-ons, then it can get wildly different in terms of the provisions and the premiums. We've seen where um, you could have different levels of investigative support by third-party experts in order to come in and say, okay, how bad is the problem? And to help very quickly. And so they were charging premiums by speed and by depth, of which I was
Wow.
saying, wow, that's very interesting, because in general, even the smallest effort, I mean, even the smallest adverse event needs speed. Speed needs to be always there. So I would say when you're looking at the policy, are they providing you the ability in order to get an expert at your door quickly and reasonably for the premium? So, and then I said that's one piece. The second piece is then what is the extent? Are there any time limits? So, or they say, well, we're going to provide for a euro amount over a particular period of time, and then you're on your own. And then the exclusions are something that we always look at to say, okay, what really is excluded? Are my subcontractors or my freelancers or are my contracted workers covered? If they're not, then do they have to have a mini policy themselves? And I guess the lens on that is, if you're doing work for clients or larger customers, you're part of a supply chain, what are their requirements? So we were doing work as a small advisory business years ago, and a large insurance client said, well, you have to have, it was a US client, so you have to have $20 million in cyber coverage. Like, 20 million in coverage. You could barely get 5 million in coverage for a reasonable amount at the time, and it's like there's just absolutely no way. So there was very unrealistic expectations from these large providers. Now we've seen that come in and become more reasonable, but it is important to look at a separate policy. It's important to look at the provisions, the exclusions, and above all, it's got to have a provision in order to act quickly, because acting quickly can save your business.
Okay. And it would be something, would you say it's something important for SME owners to look at in the next 12 months?
I definitely think so, and I think that through ISME and through a number of the organizations in Ireland, there's some great small business insurance cover providers that that would love to have a chat, and I think that I like that, because small businesses helping small businesses.
Yeah. And are you okay to take a couple more questions? We have a
Oh,
few flying in here.
absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
really engaging content. So, a question from David, and welcome back, David. Thank you very much for your question. There are differences between retention policy and backup policy. Is it best to talk to an IT service provider regarding what your cloud services provide from a retention point of view versus what is actually required under GDPR or specific business verticals?
That's very interesting. Yes, you're right in terms of retention and backup. Now, and also backup, depending on the on what your backup and who is backing up, or the business that's backing up, and then being able to go and trace those backups, extremely important. So I would say let's start from a very small business, um, sole trader, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to 10 people, that and they're using their own devices. So let's say they're using their own laptops, or Macs, or Androids, or iPhones, etc. Now, and when you look at that, it could be easy to start mapping out the services that do backups, and then you can then compare it to your retention schedules, because this way then you need to know if I have a retention schedule that says I've got a 6-month rule on certain information, I've moved it from my email system, it's gone and now on my colleague's phone. Did that phone back it up as a part of the telecommunications service plan? And in many cases, you're going to have multiple backups. So you'll have, you could have Google backup, you can have your carrier backup. So you need to understand where those backups went so that you can go and be able to recall and delete. So, but it gets to the question. It gets more difficult to start mapping this out and when you have um, client obligations, you have client information, you have employee information, and then you have the retention schedule. So I do think it is important in order to engage in some IT expertise. If you have been running with multiple services for quite some time, you have backups that are out there that you might not have a clear visibility to, and you're then updating your compliance programs to understand and adjust your retention periods. I think that's probably the most important, where you need to deal with some legacy and some what we call backup debt, that you're going to have to go and manage through. And it's not just for large businesses. A medium-sized business can have a lot of backup debt.
Absolutely. And as you were saying, the onus is on the owner or the partners in the business, essentially. So it's important, just as when
Oh
you're creating
yes.
your website, to have a certain input and not to outsource completely.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a director obligation
Yeah.
that and it falls squarely on the directors, and then it falls squarely on them in order to educate and to inform their personnel.
Okay, that's brilliant. And just to say, David Flood is with IT.ie, and in the spirit of community that we're in at the moment, is offering services. And we're happy to feature that on our website as well for any for any attendees who'd be interested in contacting David about IT services.
That's
So
great.
yeah. So we have another question from Alice. Thanks so much, Alice. Great to see you engaged. So she's saying, how about our privacy policy? So I think the previous question was talking about clients, and now it's in relation to their own personal privacy policy in the business. My
Yes.
business nature includes myself and the team. We go to people's houses, and there are more and more clients who have cameras at home. Where are we standing in relation to them recording our activities and our voices when we're at the property? It's a great
Oh,
question. Do
that's a
I
great
have,
question.
do I have liability as a company towards my team that there is a measure I need to put in place to protect their privacy at work?
Okay, I gotta think this through. Okay, because you got a lot of variables here.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a great
Okay,
question,
okay,
Alice. Very
okay.
specific.
So let's think this. This is fun. All
It's
right.
a
So
challenge for you.
yeah. So, but it's interesting because I think the answer is yes. There is an obligation. There's absolutely an obligation, and you already started down the road of that obligation by thinking about it and by asking the question, which means that you're caring and you want to sort it out. So I think that's the first step. Second step is, okay, the nature of the relationship for when your colleagues go to homes, and then is there a contract involved? Is there an agreement involved? Which then you can then start then you can place clarity in that agreement that says, if there is surveillance, images, film, voice, in a kind of mixed media, because then you could have there needs to be clear notice, and that's where then it gets gray, and then that's where I would call upon one of my favorite solicitors in order to say, what are the rules of the road when it comes to liability if something happens, or if someone is it a tort, because somebody's not holding up their end of the bargain, and then is it a colleague that places an action against the business, and then the business has to then find recourse with the client. So you kind of you look at that chain of how do I solve the problem, and how do I solve the problem in a positive way. So you have to walk that. So if there's if there's not a formal agreement, then I think then there is a there is a set of policy that you and procedure that you can place internally. And thinking about it, you probably would want to do that no matter what. So let's say you put a mixed media use um, policy together, and then with a mixed media use form that so that because of the nature of the business, being clear with the personnel that say, this is the nature of our business, and here are the parameters that we control, and then there's potentially parameters that we don't control, and having that clearly stated that says if one of the things that we will do is we will seek out to find out if there's surveillance and what it is. So this way, then you're clear that you're trying to take a proactive step. I guess you'd have to figure out what you would do, because it should be a consent situation, I think, because this way then then it's also, well, these are the parameters of the job. These are the gray areas of the job right now. Um, if and I think that then it becomes a choice by the person, as long as you're clear, you've described and you've documented, they can choose, and then you can monitor. So I think monitoring is also a very important, strong tool that you have as well. So sorry that
Yeah,
haven't been been absolutely, you know, put a
it
box
sounds
around this.
it sounds again more like an art than a science, essentially.
It would seem so. I think that we would have to explore. I would be interested to explore whether there's a contractual obligation that then could at least put some bounds and some notifications, and put a little bit of obligation on the client, which will also generally just raise the awareness that they may not even be aware that there could be a concern. Right? And I find that most people, once they're exposed and that there is a potential concern, they rise to the occasion and help out.
So the kind of the importance of communication between the
Absolutely,
parties. Okay,
absolutely.
great. Okay. Thank you so much, Alice. So we've another question from Kevin. Thanks, Kevin, for your question. John, how many admin people would you advise to have access to personal data, considering it's so easy to use SharePoint, OneDrive, etc., to share this data with other managers in the company?
Oh, that's amazing. Um, you know, I generally would advocate trying to keep as, of course, as few as possible, but then you take a look at the extent of the workload from the administrators. So in a small business, 3 people generally is a good rule. So if you have a main person that is working in that has the accountability in order to keep the other 2 informed, so the other 2 are backups, as well as if something arises that uh, one of the other 2 are not available, you can get something done quickly, especially when if you're dealing in the Office 365 environment and you want to be swift at identifying a problem or a potential breach, depending on how much personal data is handled and flowing into that system. Now, couldn't you have then um, a dialed back set of permissions? So, for instance, we went and did a compliance review with a client recently, and we looked at the not only the O365 environment, but the Azure Dev environment, and then the Azure Production Run environment. There was so many administrators, global admins. Now, if anyone has been exposed to working in the Microsoft environment, especially on the Azure side, there are so many controls that you can place and so many levels of permissioning. It gets dizzying, but you can dial that back. So that means that you can have people that have technically administrator status, and you can have many of them, but they only have certain roles. Now that also might take an IT review and an IT services review in order to sort it out, and then you can keep it current. We were using some of our automated techniques in order to provide a view, and then some expertise in order to dial it back. I hope that that helps narrowing down the answer to the question.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you so much. Right, we'll give you a breather from questions for a while and we'll come back to it later on. Thank you so much.
Sure. What I'll do is, I know we are roughly what, about an hour, closing in an hour and a half in?
Yes, we're coming up on 12 now.
Okay. All right, so let me just take a look. So we have and I'll flow through these fairly quickly because then everyone will be able to get these tips and guidance and review them. And we could certainly always take some additional questions and provide some answers afterward as post, however Ellie and you would like. So one of the things that in terms of when we think about working remotely, and this will also apply for when you're back on-prem and the combination, is it really goes back to the fundamentals of having a clear policy, having procedures, and having guidance that makes sense in plain language, and having people understand those obligations so that they can follow it. They can't follow it if they don't understand it. We talked about using approved technology for handling personal data, and whether that approved technology is saying, oh, everybody's using their own device. And so then some of the rules could be, okay, everybody has to use anti-malware on their smartphones. And we're not going to dictate what you use, you just got to use something, but tell us what you're using so we can inventory it. That's a perfectly reasonable request. Or where in some cases we say, well, you know what, we're going to be using Office 365. We're going to be using some of the features like Intune or some of the mobile device management, where we want the ability, and we would like the approval of somebody that's using their own device in order to remotely wipe that device if there is a data compromise. Well, some may go, wow, well, I got so much stuff. I live on this device. No, I don't want to do that. Well, then what are you going to do? So, thinking through that policy and the procedure and the cases where if it is a joint decision between a person and the company, how do you resolve the potential conflict? That's important to think about it up front. Very interesting, considering confidentiality when holding conversations using the screen, especially with remote working conditions, families all together. You have multiple workers, different companies, all in a closed space. So I think that it really goes to the goodness of human nature, and I'm an optimist that, you know, honest people are honest, and they're not looking to go and pull information from one company and use it in an adverse way for another company. But you have to protect people and not place them in that potentially compromising situation. So having some rules of the road about confidentiality, it could be as simple as using the folders. If you're allowing printing, like in number 4, then using folders, keeping things secure to the extent you can as a clean desk. I know I don't follow it as well as some of my colleagues who like clean that desk, and so before I go, I gotta put everything away because I'm more of a paper bomb, and then I pull it all back together. But it's difficult with the remote working situation, and we understand that. Trying not to mix the organization's data with the personal data. Difficult with shared calendaring. Difficult with the ability in order to forward calendar invites, which then could have attachments, which then could have permissions. You know, so again, doing that data map that we talked about, doing the technical map that we talked about is important. Locking things away, physical locks, small cabinets, a drawer, cleaning out a sock drawer, and saying, okay, this one's I'm using this for work right now that I'm home, and that's what, and then it's basically respecting the boundaries. All of the things that we have been taught and that we hear about are more prevalent today. Excuse me, the malware and the attacks are more prevalent today because, and we see that, I know that one of the companies that we work with, Bitdefender, came out with uh, a very detailed report, and the spike in malware related to COVID-19 and COVID-19 spoof emails, and so and a lot of the other providers, Sophos and Trend Micro and others, have come out with their analyses as well. So you're getting more and more stats. So don't open web links and attachments unless you absolutely are sure that you know that they're from trusted source. Using strong passwords, we'll get to that in a moment. Um, Communicating securely. So Zoom has, in my opinion, I know that they're getting beaten up left and right, but I think that they've risen to the challenge. And so some of the things that they've done, you've seen security features quickly rolled out, additional security features and layered security. So that's important. We're seeing that we saw updates in Teams. There was a massive jump in Teams use, and so then there was updates almost on a rolling basis in order to strengthen certain things. And then keeping the software up to date is important. But I think that is less and less a concern, rather than keeping your software lists and your cloud service providers and what connections you're enabling between them. So I think that is a bit of an update to number 10. So when we look at strong passwords, I think this is always fun. And so, a number of us love to go out to XKCD, and you just love the cartoons, love giving them the hat tip, because just over the years, just great stuff. So the concept here, not going to get into the math, but the concept here is that for such a long time, people have been trying to make passwords by substituting different characters and then making common words or phrases with those substitutions. Well, those are very easy for computers to guess. But it turns out, and it's a little, a little 180 degrees than you might think, in that just stringing together just words has a very strong effect to making it difficult to crack that password. Then if you add in some of the rules that you'll see on the left. Now, general, some systems force those rules on you. Some systems are quite open. In large companies, there are generally password combinations and similar character sequence rules that are imposed. Um, Even in our software as a service, we provide to clients, we provide them with an ability to choose their password rules and some of the frequency and all that. So by using the symbols and using different characters and avoiding substitution, and using what XKCD said here in terms of the combination, you can make some very strong passwords. And additionally, then technically there's password vaults that are out there. So there's LastPass and there's 1Password and others where you can make some really, really strong passwords and not have to remember them. You just have to remember how to get into your vault. So we're seeing more and more requests for reviewing compliance procedures and on the enabling of that, and weaving those into the security and compliance program. Some of the heightened risks, secure connections. So while working remotely and working at home, we have wildly different communications and connection setups that are enabled in homes. So you have broadband, and then you have the fiber services, and then you have different routers, and you have different wireless, and so you have all these different things. So one of the things that we look at are low-cost virtual private network VPN uh, sets of services where you can at least add some layers of transport security and encryption onto onto that connection, as well as then, as we talked about a number of times today, um, having multiple ways of authenticating and validating you, and you have the right in order to get into those systems. Now, on the company issued devices, we talked a little bit about that before. We see more and more of the BYOD. I still believe that there is a communication and a discussion that must take place, and it needs to then follow with policy. It needs to follow with then clear forms and agreements for onboarding, and then periodic reviews of how everybody is going to work with their own devices. It is so critical with all of these cloud services enabled, and all the advanced abilities for these devices that people carry around. We talked about the remote working conditions. Data loss prevention, I think that there are features that are becoming more and more accessible to smaller businesses to enable data loss prevention, and whether it is email scanning, it is being able to tag emails and then have particular technical controls placed on them. So a certain email can get tagged and then encryption is added, or particular um, data handling classifications can get placed on it. Again, knowing the capabilities, choosing which ones you're going to use, and then once you have that choice, there's an obligation to keep it current. We talked a little bit about the increased phishing and fraud. We won't need to go into more detail, except for that it will increase, and I think the the reviews that we'll see, either law enforcement or the cyber centers, hopefully, because of the increased scrutiny, it'll have a positive knock-on effect for people working remotely, in that they're going to have more resources and more alerts that are coming out. And more alerts mean more awareness, and fewer people are clicking or falling prey to attacks. We talked about third-party risk. Um, I'll stop here for a minute and see if there are additional questions, because this is really important, as one of the cases that is changing the way that we're looking at consent.
I think those are great points, John. Thank you so much. Back to the passwords. So Europol has launched a business email compromise campaign in the last year, which they talk about one of the key risks that's coming through from social engineering, information that people are providing on social media. And just from my own personal perspective, the amount of information that people share publicly on some platforms, in terms of not having any restriction on the audience, is a real opportunity for people who have malintent to essentially hack information and infiltrate passwords. And this was something that Europol were talking about through that program.
Well, I think that the extent of sharing and the extent of the sharing culture adds a level of angst to security professionals, quite honestly, as well as then adds a set of accountability for those that are entering into sharing, as well as then, as we've been discussing today, awareness and understanding of the benefits of and the shortcomings of the systems and the facilities that you're using. They all go hand in hand, and I think that um, it's good that we have efforts in terms of those eyes on and taking a look at and analyzing where those compromises are more prevalent coming in, and what we can do about it. At least getting more practical guidance and awareness. Again, it really goes
Absolutely.
back to that awareness. And if being more aware, you can at least take proactive action.
If you don't understand it, you can't follow it. I thought that was a really key point that you made. Um, Things are most effective when they're communicated on an ordinary level, because we can get totally caught up and overwhelmed in legalese and lots of different definitions.
Right.
But this is very practical information. Thank you so much. The second thing then is the balance between personalization, which we know is one of the key trends at the moment in marketing. I think one of the key success factors as well that's been enabled by so many data platforms, that only recently, I suppose, maybe to the public knowledge, have become known as data platforms. They provide a service, but they also harness a large amount of data. So for businesses of all sizes, where does that balance lie in terms of trying to personalize the offer or the service or the product for the customer, and then in terms of managing the duty of care and the privacy, in your
That's a
opinion?
great question. That is absolutely a great question. And I think that we tried to capture in this particular slide are some key points that will help to analyze that. So when you look at the journey in terms of attracting a customer and converting that customer to your service, and then onboarding them, and then through the cycle of serving them and having them as a customer, the there are key considerations that we look at, and it may be hard to see on there, but in on the angled text, we've got transparency, privacy policy, cookie banners, site security, lawful basis, the things that we've been speaking about. In that it goes back to those basics of when we're able to have a clear view of that data handled, and the clear view of why we're handling, and the clear view of why we're allowed to, that really forms a great repeatable lens through that journey, as well as then you could start taking a look at the extent of information that is needed to perform a particular task. So on the bottom left, sort of like I mentioned before, one of my pet grievances is all of the data brokers and the lead gen folks that are just not considering privacy when they're pulling this information, and they're placing their small business customers who are saying, oh yeah, that's a great service, at risk. and and it is really about those harvesting techniques. And so it also goes back to when we look at some of the platforms that you might use or the services you might use. Again, not not so fun, but important to look at the terms of service, look at the data processing agreement. I mean, I'll drag something in here, see if this works. I'll drag this into the screen here, see if it pops in properly. So I pulled up um, the HubSpot data processing agreement. So a data processing agreement, we didn't go into much depth, but this is basically the rules of the road for you as a business, and you are accountable for controlling what happens to the personal data. You make the decisions. You then contract with a service like a HubSpot, which then becomes your processor, and they take instructions from you electronically, and you have access to their platform where you can then configure how they process the information. You start scrolling down. This thing is thick. It's very well done. I'm not knocking them at all. I think they've done a very good job. It's in plain language. It's very detailed. If you take a look in the center section here, they come up with the details of processing, the security measures. They have the standard clauses that are they're legalese, but they're understandable. And then they come and they then list out their sub-processors. So they've done a third party, a fourth party, and we call it even, and sometimes some of these services will list out a fifth party. These are the good ones. What you're talking about, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that how do you weed out the ones that really have your care in mind, and at least then if you're working with them and you understand the data processing agreements, like their obligations, without with compared to others that might not. And I think that's where it really comes down to is the extent of uh, the the clarity of an agreement with a service that, and again, it's not fun, but going through this is quite eye-opening. So, Michael, did I cover your question, or do we need to go in a different direction?
No, I think that that definitely covers it. I mean, one of the things just to mention is that all of the resources from today will be available on the website. We aim to have that done over the next day. And as always, reach out to myself or Eilish. We're both running the program with any questions that you have. And we do take all questions into consideration. And we're looking to provide as personalized an experience for you as possible. So I don't see any further questions coming in. But I just wanted to say thank you so much to John Papalicio and his team from Sovi. They've all been here today. Great support for John, and it's been so engaging and practical for everyone attending. And just to remind everyone that we do have our marketing webinar on tomorrow. We're delighted to be joined by Anne Gallagher as our keynote speaker and facilitated by Sheena McGowan and Orla Veal from Griffith College, who will be facilitating tomorrow's session. So we hope to see you then at 10:30. And until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Michael, Eilish, and everyone. Thank you, team.
Delighted.